In a land where the wind doesn't just blow, it hunts. A man was about to pull the trigger on his dying horse when a strange sound led him to something far more shocking. A woman chained to a fence in the freezing wild, and two newborn babies moments from death. Who would leave them there? And why? This story reminds us, even in the harshest world, humanity survives through the courage to protect one another. This channel tells stories of the Wild West, cowboys, frontier love. If this story pulls you in, gently like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The wind in the Wind River Basin didn't just blow, it searched. It sought out every gap in a man's woolens, every crack in a sod hut, and every doubt in a soul. Silas Vane knelt in the churned, frozen slush, his breath a ragged plume of silver. Before him his buckskin gelding lay trembling, the forelegs snapped clean, a jagged white bone shard peeking through the hide like a confession. The horse's eyes were rolling, rimmed with the frantic white of the dying. "Easy, brother," Silas murmured, his voice a low rumble that barely carried past his beard. He drew his Colt. The metal was so cold it felt like it would fuse to his palm. He thumbed the hammer back, the mechanical click sounding like a gavel in the vast, empty theater of the Wyoming plains. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, offering a silent Cherokee prayer for the beast that had carried him 300 miles from the prying eyes of Texas. Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, the wind shifted. It wasn't a scream. A scream was a soft thing, easily swallowed by a gale. This was a rhythmic, metallic clink, clink, clink. It was the sound of iron meeting iron, a deliberate, desperate percussion. Silas froze. He lowered the revolver, his ears tracking the sound. It was coming from the Sterling line, a barbed wire scar that separated the lush valley floor from the scrub-choked ridges he called home. He put the horse out of its misery with a single merciful shot that echoed flatly against the gray sky. Then, leaving his saddle in gear, he moved toward the sound, his long-strided gait silent despite the crusty snow. He found her at the marker post, a heavy timber reinforced with an iron strap. She wasn't a girl. She was a woman grown, though the cold had carved her face into a mask of pale marble. She was shackled to the post by her left wrist, the heavy iron cuff biting into a sleeve of homespun wool. But she wasn't tugging at the chain. She was huddled over a bundle of bison robes at her feet, her head bowed. As Silas approached, he realized what the sound was. She was using her teeth to tear at the frozen leather ties of the bundle, her jaw working with a primal, rhythmic ferocity. "Step back," Silas commanded, his hand hovering over his holster. The woman didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She lifted her head, her eyes a startling, defiant amber amidst a face smeared with soot and frost. "The wind is turning," she said, her voice raspy, stripped of everything but iron. "My hands are gone to the frost. I can't undo the knots." Silas looked down. Inside the robes, two tiny puckered faces peeked out. Infants, their skin turning a dangerous shade of blue-gray. Twins. In the Sterling territory, where Bartholomew Sterling ruled with a god complex and a hatred for weak blood, a twin birth was whispered to be a curse, a biological waste of his pure ranching legacy. Silas drew a heavy Bowie knife. The woman didn't pull away from the blade. She leaned toward it. "Cut the girls loose first," she whispered. Silas sliced through the frozen leather wraps. Then, with two precise blows of a stone he used as a hammer against his knife's spine, he sheared the pin on the shackle. The woman collapsed, not into a faint, but onto the bundle of her children, shielding them with her body. Silas reached down, his massive hands catching her by the shoulders. She was terrifyingly light, skin and bone held together by sheer spite. "I can carry you to my cabin," Silas said, looking back at the miles of white death between them and safety. but I can't carry 3. Clare Sterling looked him dead in the eye, her gaze as sharp as the blacksmith's tools she'd grown up with. "Then take the girls," she said, shoving the bundle into his chest. "Leave me if you have to. Let the wolves have the mother, but don't let the frost claim the daughters." Silas looked from the dying light on the horizon to the woman who refused to break. For the first time in 15 years, the silence in his head was replaced by a roar. "Nobody's staying for the wolves today," Silas growled. He tucked the infants into the breast of his heavy bison coat, feeling their fading warmth against his own heart, and hoisted Clare Sterling over his shoulder. He began to walk, each step a middle finger to the Wyoming winter, and the man who had left them there to die. The cabin on the ridge was not a home. It was a fortress of solitude built from cedar logs and packed earth, huddled against the lee side of a granite outcropping. Inside, the air was a stale mixture of cold ash, dried tobacco, and the sharp medicinal tang of pine resin. Silas kicked the door shut with his heel, the heavy oak slab booming against the frame, sealing out the murderous howl of the Wind River gale. He didn't waste time with a lamp. He knew the geography of his floor by touch. He lowered Clare Sterling onto a heap of elk hides near the hearth. She was shivering now, a violent, rhythmic shaking that rattled her teeth and made her breath come in short, jagged gasps. This was the dangerous stage. If the shivering stopped before the warmth took hold, she was a dead woman. "Stay still," Silas commanded, though he knew she had little choice in the matter. He moved with the economy of a man who had survived a dozen winters alone. He knelt by the hearth, striking a flint until a spark caught the dry tinder. Within minutes, a small, hungry flame began to lick at the split pine. Only then did he turn his attention to the bundle tucked inside his coat. The infants were eerily quiet. Silas unbuttoned his bison fur parka, the heat of his own body rolling off him in a visible steam. He laid the bundle on the furs next to Clare. "The girls," Clare rasped, her eyes fluttering open. The amber in them was clouded, the pupils blown wide. "Are they?" "Alive," Silas said, though he wasn't entirely sure for how much longer. He didn't possess a midwife's touch, but he knew the triage of the trail. He stripped off his heavy outer layers until he was in his thin wool undershirt. Then, with steady, calloused hands, he began to peel away the wet, frozen layers of homespun cloth from the babies. They were tiny, impossibly small, their skin a mottled, translucent purple. "Listen to me," Silas said, his voice dropping into that low, vibrating frequency he used to calm panicked horses. "They need the heat of the blood, not the fire. The fire will blister them. They need you." He helped Clare sit up. Her fingers were useless, swollen into pale sausages of frostbitten flesh. Silas didn't apologize for his roughness. He worked with the grim efficiency of a surgeon. He unfastened the stays of her bodice, baring her skin to the flickering orange light of the growing fire. "Skin to skin," he muttered. He placed the first infant against her chest, then the second. He draped his own bison coat over the 3 of them, creating a makeshift incubator of fur and human heat. "Hold them," he whispered. "Don't let them go." Clare's breath hitched. A single tear escaped her eye, freezing almost instantly on her cheek. She hooked her stiff arms around the small lumps beneath the fur, her head falling back against the logs. I thought the wind had taken us." Silas didn't answer. He couldn't afford the luxury of sentiment. He turned to the hearth, moving a heavy cast-iron pot over the flames. He melted snow, then added a handful of dried herbs, willow bark for the pain, and a bit of precious sugar for the shock. As the water heated, the silence of the cabin was broken by a thin, reedy wail. It was the most beautiful sound Silas had ever heard, a high-pitched, indignant cry that signaled a refusal to die. "That's the first one," Clare choked out, a ghost of a smile touching her cracked lips. "That's Merritt. She always was the loudest." "Good," Silas said. "Loud means lungs. Lungs mean life." He spent the next hour in a blur of motion. He fed the fire. He soaked rags in the warm willow bark water and began the slow, agonizing process of thawing Claire's hands and feet. She didn't scream, though the pain of returning circulation, the hot ache, was enough to make a grown man vomit. She simply bit her lip until it bled, her eyes fixed on the two small lives tucked against her heart. By the time the moon reached its zenith, casting a silver graveyard light across the snowdrifts outside, the cabin had warmed. The smell of wood smoke and damp wool settled over them like a blanket. Silas sat on a low stool across from her, cleaning his Winchester. It was a ritual of grounding. He didn't look at her directly, but he was acutely aware of her presence, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, the way the firelight caught the copper strands in her dark hair. "Why?" he asked finally. The question was a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. Clare looked up. The cloudiness had left her eyes, replaced by a hard, metallic clarity. "My father was a blacksmith in the basin for 20 years. He taught me that if you hit a piece of iron long enough, it either breaks or it turns into a blade. Bartholomew Sterling wanted a blade. He wanted a son to inherit the empire he's carving out of the Arapaho lands." She shifted the babies under the coat. "When I gave him girls, twins, he saw it as a betrayal, a waste of his seed. He told the town I'd birthed monsters. He said the law of the frontier didn't apply to abominations." "He's a man of the cloth, or so I hear," Silas said, his voice laced with acid. "He's a man of the land," Clare corrected. "The land is his god, and he didn't want 2 more mouths to feed that wouldn't grow up to brand his cattle or shoot his enemies." Silas paused, his rag frozen on the barrel of his rifle. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her hands were still wrapped in warm cloths, but she held herself with a regal, rugged dignity. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor, waiting for her next move. "You stayed," Silas observed. "I had nowhere to go. My father is dead. The forge is cold. Until today I thought I could outlast him." Silas stood up to bank the fire. As he moved, his shirt pulled tight across his back, and the light hit the scar on his own shoulder, a jagged, raised brand he'd carried since he was 10 years old. Claire's breath caught. "Wait." Silas stopped. "What?" "The mark on your shoulder," she whispered. "Move toward the light." Silas hesitated, then stepped closer to the hearth. He turned his back to her, pulling the collar of his shirt down. There, burned into the dark skin, was a symbol, a stylized O with a line through the center like a dying eye. He heard her gasp. Slowly, painfully, Clare shifted the bison robe. She pulled her chemise down just enough to reveal the curve of her own shoulder. There it was, the same mark, faded, silvered with age, but unmistakable. "The St. Jude's Home for Foundlings," she whispered. "San Antonio." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. He turned to face her, his face a mask of stone. "That orphanage burned down 20 years ago. No one was supposed to get out." "I got out," Clare said, her voice trembling for the first time. "I was a charity ward. My father bought me from the state to work the bellows when I was 6. He was a hard man, but he was better than the priests." Silas sat back down, the weight of the coincidence pressing the air from his lungs. He had fled Texas to escape that mark, to escape the memory of the land grab massacres where children were branded like cattle before their families' properties were seized. "Small world," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Clare said, looking down at her daughters. "It's a cruel one, and it's just caught up with us." The morning arrived, not with a sunrise, but with a bruising of the sky, a deep violet gray that promised more snow. The great dye-up was in full swing. The cattle in the valley were already huddling in frozen circles, dying where they stood by the hundreds. Inside the cabin, a different kind of work was beginning. Clare was sitting up, her hands heavily bandaged, but mobile. She watched Silas with a quiet intensity as he prepared a meager breakfast of salt pork and hardtack soaked in water. "You're a tracker," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was," Silas replied. "Now I'm just a man who wants to be left alone." "A man who wants to be left alone doesn't build a cabin 3 miles from the Sterling line. You're watching him." Silas didn't deny it. He handed her a wooden bowl. "Eat. You need the strength if you're going to milk that goat out back." "I can do more than milk a goat," Clare said, her eyes flashing. She looked toward the corner of the room where Silas's old Winchester sat propped against the wall. "That rifle, the firing pin is catching. I heard it click twice when you were cleaning it last night." Silas frowned. "It's an old piece. The cold warps the spring." "It's not the cold, it's the seating. If you have a file and a heat source, I can fix it." Silas looked at her bandaged hands. "You're in no condition to work metal, Mrs. Sterling." "I am Clare, and I've worked metal with blisters worse than these. Metal has a soul, Mr. Vane. If you treat it right, it won't fail you. Right now, your soul is sticking." Against his better judgment, Silas fetched his small kit of gunsmithing tools and a handheld bellows. He watched in silence as Clare, clumsy at first but gaining precision with every movement, used the heat of the hearth to temper the small, delicate components of the rifle. She worked with a terrifying focus, her brow furrowed, her lips pulled back in a grimace of concentration. "You speak of the metal like it's a person," Silas remarked, fascinated despite himself. "Metal doesn't lie," she murmured, filing a microscopic burr off the pin. "Humans do. Bartholomew lied about the deed. He lied about the babies. He even lied about how my husband died." Silas sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the shh, providing a rhythmic counterpoint to her filing. "The town says he fell in the canyon." "He didn't fall," Clare said, her voice dropping an octave. "Thomas was a good man, but he was soft. He couldn't stand what Bartholomew was doing to the smaller ranchers. He refused to sign over my dower rights, the land my father left me. A week later, Thomas was found at the bottom of the Devil's Gate. But when I washed his body for burial, his fingernails were blue, not from the cold. From the nightshade Bartholomew grows in his conservatory." Silas stopped sharpening. The air in the cabin grew heavy. Poison. It was a coward's weapon, but effective in a territory where the law was 100 miles away. "If you know this, why didn't you go to the sheriff?" Clare let out a short, bitter laugh. "Sheriff Miller owes his badge to Sterling. In this basin, Bartholomew is the judge, the jury, and the man who pays the hangman." The morning passed in a tense, industrious quiet. But the peace was shattered when Silas went to the window to check the horizon. He stiffened. "Stay away from the glass." "What is it?" Silas grabbed his field glasses. Out on the white expanse of the ridge, about half a mile away, 4 riders were moving in a slow, deliberate circle. They weren't hunting for elk. They were riding Sterling-branded horses, their yellow slickers bright against the snow. "They're circling," Silas muttered, "casting for a scent." "They'll find the horse," Clare said, her voice trembling. "The buckskin you had to shoot. They'll know someone was there." Silas watched as one of the riders dismounted. The man knelt in the snow, likely looking at the tracks Silas had tried to sweep away. "They're not just looking for you, Clare," Silas said, his eyes narrowing. "Look at the way they're riding. Those aren't ranch hands. Those are regulators, hired guns from down south." He turned back to her, his face grim. "They're circling the property like they're marking a kill. They want to see if I'll bolt." Clare stood up, clutching her daughters to her chest. "If they find you with me, they'll kill you too. Bartholomew can't let a witness live. Especially not a drifter." Silas picked up the Winchester. He cycled the lever. The action was butter-smooth now, the metallic clack echoing with a new lethal authority. Clare had fixed it. "I've been a drifter my whole life," Silas said, his thumb tracing the brand on his shoulder through his shirt. "I've run from Texas, run from the law, and run from that orphanage. I'm tired of running, Clare." He walked to the door and barred it with a heavy cedar beam. "Let them circle," Silas growled, his eyes turning to flint. "The snow is deep and I know every drift on this ridge. If they want to come into my silence, they're going to find out just how loud a Winchester can be." But as he looked out the slit in the door, he saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the riders wasn't looking at the cabin. He was holding up a piece of iron, a horseshoe. He tossed it into the snow near Silas's gate. It was a message. The horseshoe was forged in the Sterling smithy. It was a claim. "They know," Silas whispered. "They're not hunting us. They're waiting for the sun to go down." The shadows on the snow began to lengthen, stretching like long black fingers toward the cabin door. The thaw was coming, but in the Wind River Basin, the melt always brought the mud, and the mud always ran red. The town of Bitter Creek looked like a skeletal remain bleached white by the Wyoming frost. It was a one-street scar on the earth, dominated by the towering silhouettes of the Sterling grain elevator and the steeple of the Presbyterian church, both owned by the same man. Silas rode into town on a borrowed mule, his silhouette hunched against the biting wind. He had left Clare with a loaded shotgun and a promise. "If the door rattles and I don't whistle Yellow Rose, you shoot through the wood." The livery stable was a cavern of shadows and the scent of ammonia. As Silas dismounted, the swinging doors creaked, and a man stepped out from the gloom. Bartholomew Sterling didn't look like a monster. He looked like a king in exile. He wore a coat of silver fox fur and carried a cane topped with a polished wolf's skull. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, pale, flat, and devoid of heat. "Mr. Vane," Sterling said, his voice a cultured baritone that felt out of place in the grit of the frontier. "I was wondering when the mountain would come to the valley." Silas didn't move. His hand stayed near his thigh. "I need salt, flour, and kerosene. I'm not here for a sermon, Sterling." Bartholomew stepped closer, his cane tapping rhythmically against the frozen dirt. "Let us dispense with the theater. You have something of mine, a woman of unstable humors, and 2 unfortunate accidents she carried into this world." "I found a woman left to die on a fence post," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I don't see an owner's mark on her." Sterling smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "Everything in this basin bears my mark, Silas, whether it's burned into the hide or written in the ledger. Clare is a widow. She is grieving. She has stolen property that belongs to the Sterling estate, namely, herself and the heirs to my brother's name." He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a drawstring pouch. It hit the timber of a nearby stall with a heavy metallic thud. "There is $500 in gold in that bag," Sterling whispered. "And in my pocket, I have a deed. It's for the valley floor adjacent to your ridge. Prime grazing land. Water rights included. All I require is for you to leave your cabin door unbarred tonight. Go for a long ride. When you return, the distractions will be gone, and you will be a wealthy man." Silas looked at the bag. To a man who had spent his life eating dust and sleeping on frozen ground, that gold represented a lifetime of peace. He could leave the bitter north. He could go to California. He could disappear. "500 is a lot of money for a crazy woman," Silas said, playing the part of the greedy drifter. He picked up the bag, feeling the delicious heavy weight of the coins. "It is an investment in silence," Sterling replied. "Do we have an accord?" Silas shoved the pouch into his coat. "I'll be out hunting tonight. The ridge is a big place. Hard to see who comes and goes in the dark." Sterling nodded, satisfaction gleaming in his cold eyes. "A wise choice, Mr. Vane. Ambition is the only thing that separates a man from the beasts." As Silas led the mule out of the livery, a shadow detached itself from the side of the building. It was Sheriff Miller, a man whose tin star was tarnished by years of looking the other way. He stepped into Silas's path, his face etched with a strange, weary pity. "You took the money, Silas," Miller said, his voice a hushed rasp. "Money is money, Sheriff." Miller leaned in, the smell of cheap whiskey clinging to him. "That gold in your pocket, it's blood money. Bartholomew didn't get this empire by being a good neighbor. He got it by erasing people. I know where you came from, Vane. I've seen the papers Bartholomew keeps in his safe. I know who your father was, the man who tried to fight the land grabs in Texas before they burned that orphanage to hide the bodies." Silas felt a jolt of electricity run up his spine. "What are you talking about? You think it's a coincidence you and Clare both have that mark?" Miller shook his head. "Bartholomew wasn't just a rancher back then. He was a liquidator for the railroads. He's been hunting your kind for 30 years. If you think that gold is a gift, you're a fool. It's a down payment on your headstone." Silas didn't blink. He mounted the mule, his jaw set in a hard line. "Thanks for the warning, Sheriff. But in the basin, the only thing a man can trust is the weight of his own lead." He rode out of town, the gold heavy against his ribs, his mind a storm of revelations. He wasn't just saving a widow. He was finally facing the ghost that had chased him across half a continent. The ride back to the ridge was a blur of white-knuckle tension. Silas bypassed the main trail, taking the mule through a treacherous goat path to ensure he wasn't being followed. When he reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the peaks, bleeding a bruised purple across the horizon. He burst through the door, his lungs burning. Clare was standing by the hearth, the heavy shotgun leveled at his chest. When she saw it was him, she lowered the weapon, her face pale and drawn. "You were gone too long," she said. Silas didn't speak. He walked to the table and emptied the pouch of gold. The coins spilled across the rough-hewn wood, glittering mockingly in the firelight. Clare stared at the gold. She looked at the coins, then up at Silas, her eyes filling with a sudden sharp betrayal. "He bought you." "He tried," Silas said. $500, Clare whispered, her voice trembling. "That's what my life is worth? That's what my daughters are worth to you?" "Clare, listen." "I should have known," she cried, her voice cracking. "Every man in this territory has a price. You're just like the rest. You took the blood money. Did you promise him you'd leave the door open? Did you tell him where I sleep?" She lunged for the shotgun, but Silas was faster. He caught her by the wrists, pinning her against the log wall. The heat of the fire roared between them, and for a moment the only sound was their ragged breathing. "I took the gold so he wouldn't send 20 men today," Silas hissed, his face inches from hers. "I took it to buy us 12 hours. I took it because if I refused, he would have killed me in that livery stable and come for you before I was cold." Clare struggled against his grip, her amber eyes burning with a mixture of fury and terror. "You lie! You're going to leave us!" "I have never left a soul behind in my life," Silas roared. "I spent my whole life running from men like him because I couldn't fight back then. I'm done running, Clare. That gold isn't for a new life. It's for the funeral of the man who branded us." The fight suddenly drained out of her. She sagged against him, her forehead resting against his chest. The smell of wood smoke, iron, and desperation hung thick in the air. Silas didn't let go. He felt the frantic beat of her heart against his own, a wild, trapped bird seeking an exit. Slowly, Clare lifted her head. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. "Why?" she whispered. "Why risk everything for a widow and 2 ghosts?" Silas looked at her, at the soot on her cheek, the iron-willed strength in her jaw, the shared history burned into her skin. He didn't have the words. He had never been a man of prose. Instead, he leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and wood smoke. It wasn't a gentle thing. It was a collision of 2 lonely, battered souls recognizing each other in the dark. It was a promise made in the shadow of the gallows. Clare pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair, her breath hitching in her throat. For a heartbeat, the world outside, the snow, the Sterlings, the cold, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of the forge and the hammer strike of their hearts. The moment was shattered by a sharp, whistling hiss. Thwack! An arrow, wrapped in oil-soaked, flaming rags, pierced the sod roof of the cabin. A second later, another one thudded into the heavy oak door. "The thaw is over," Silas whispered, pulling away and grabbing his Winchester. Outside, the orange glow of torches began to dance on the snow-covered slopes. The Sterlings hadn't waited for the door to be unbarred. They had come to burn the ridge to the ground. "Get the girls into the root cellar," Silas commanded, his voice turning back into the cold iron of a soldier. "Now, Clare." She didn't argue. She scooped the twins from their bed of furs and disappeared beneath the floorboards. Silas kicked out the embers of the fire, plunging the cabin into a tactical gloom. He climbed onto a bench, peering through a rifle slit. Through the swirling snow, he saw them. A dozen riders, their silhouettes jagged against the firelight. At the center of the line sat Bartholomew Sterling, his silver fox coat glowing like a shroud. He didn't look like a rancher. He looked like a god of the underworld come to reclaim his property. "Silas Vane," Sterling's voice echoed off the granite cliffs. "You took the gold. You signed the contract. Return the property and I might let you die in the snow instead of the fire." Silas felt the weight of the Winchester in his hands. The rifle Clare had fixed, the weapon that now had a soul. He thumbed the hammer back. "The contract is void, Sterling," Silas yelled back. "The only thing I'm returning to you is the lead you've earned." He squeezed the trigger, and the night erupted in flame. The first shot from Silas's Winchester took the hat off a Sterling rider and buried itself in the trunk of a pine. It was a warning, a line drawn in the frozen dirt. But Bartholomew Sterling wasn't a man who heeded warnings. He signaled with a gloved hand, and the night dissolved into a jagged rhythm of muzzle flashes. "Cover the windows!" Silas roared over the deafening cracks of the rifles. Inside the cabin, the air turned acrid with the smell of burnt sulfur. Bullets thudded into the thick cedar logs, spitting splinters like shrapnel. Silas moved from one rifle slit to the next, a shadow among shadows. He didn't fire rapidly. He fired with the cold, calculated precision of a man who knew his ammunition was finite. Below the floorboards, in the cramped earthen darkness of the root cellar, Clare held the twins to her chest. Their small whimpers were drowned out by the thunder above. She could hear the heavy thump-thump of Silas's boots, the metallic clack-slide of the Winchester's lever, and the terrifyingly close whistle of lead passing through the sod roof. A flaming arrow hissed through a gap in the shutter, landing in a pile of dry kindling near the hearth. "Silas! The fire!" Clare screamed. Silas didn't turn. "Stay down, Clare." He dropped a rider who had ventured too close to the porch, the man falling silently into the melting slush. But the fire was spreading. The orange glow began to eat at the interior of the cabin, illuminating the sparse furniture and the gold coins still scattered on the table. Blood money now reflecting the flames of a funeral pyre. Clare couldn't stay down. The frontier steel her father had forged in her didn't allow for hiding while a home burned. She shoved the babies into a hollowed-out crate lined with sheepskin and scrambled up the ladder. "Get back down!" Silas barked, his face streaked with soot. "Shut up and move!" Clare countered. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket, soaked it in the water barrel, and threw it over the growing flames. She beat at the fire with a primal ferocity, her bandaged hands screaming in pain, but she didn't stop until the orange glow died into a foul-smelling steam. Silas glanced at her, a flicker of grim admiration crossing his features. "The door, Clare! They're coming for the door!" He was right. 3 men had dismounted and were rushing the porch with a heavy timber, a makeshift ram. Silas leaned out the window to intercept them, but a volley of fire from the tree line pinned him down. Boom! The cabin shuddered. The cedar beam Silas had used to bar the door groaned, a hairline fracture appearing in the wood. Boom! "Silas!" "I see 'em!" Silas dropped his rifle and drew his Colt. He stood directly in front of the door. As the timber hit a third time and the wood splintered, Silas fired through the center of the oak slab. A scream erupted from the other side, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the porch. The remaining attackers scrambled back into the darkness. For a moment, a ringing silence fell over the ridge, broken only by the crackle of the remaining embers and the heavy breathing of the two survivors inside. "Is that it?" Claire whispered, her hand gripping the handle of the double-barrel shotgun Silas had left her. "No," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sterling doesn't quit. He's waiting for—" He stopped. From the distance, down the valley trail, came a new sound. It wasn't the chaotic hoofbeats of ranch hands. It was the steady, disciplined trot of several horses. And then a sound that chilled Silas more than Sterling's threats. A brass bugle call, thin and mournful in the wind. "The law," Silas muttered. A voice boomed from the darkness, amplified by a tin cone. "This is Federal Marshal Josiah Vance. Silas Vane, you are under arrest for the theft of government property and the murder of a deputy in Bayard County. Throw out your weapons and come out with your hands high, or we level this structure." Claire looked at Silas, her eyes wide with shock. "Theft? Murder? Silas, what are they talking about?" Silas didn't look at her. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had tried to build a quiet life on a foundation of secrets. "The horse I rode out of Texas. It belonged to a man who didn't want to let it go. The deputy was a Sterling man in a different suit. I didn't murder him, Claire. I survived him." "Silas, they aren't here for Sterling," Silas said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Bartholomew must have telegraphed them days ago. He didn't just want you back, Claire. He wanted me erased by the very law I've been running from." The door was kicked open, this time from the outside, by a man in a long duster wearing a heavy silver star. Silas didn't fight. He looked at Claire, then at the cellar where the babies lay, and slowly raised his hands. As the marshal's men swarmed the cabin, pinning Silas to the floor and ratcheting heavy iron cuffs onto his wrists, Bartholomew Sterling stepped into the doorway. He looked down at Silas with the detached interest of a scientist looking at a pinned insect. "Justice is a patient predator, Mr. Vane," Sterling purred. He turned his gaze to Claire, who stood shivering by the hearth, the shotgun taken from her hands. "Now, Claire, put on your coat. It's time to come home." The Sterling Manor was a monument to ego. Built of imported stone and dark mahogany, it sat atop the highest hill in the basin like a vulture perched on a rib cage. Claire sat in the great hall, her daughters tucked into a gilded cradle that felt more like a cage. She had been rescued, or so the town was told. To the servants and the local gossip mongers, she was the grieving, delirious widow brought back to the safety of her brother-in-law's protection. But Claire saw the truth in the armed men patrolling the hallways and the way the doors were locked from the outside. "You look well, Claire," Bartholomew said, walking into the hall. He had traded his furs for a silk smoking jacket. He poured 2 glasses of sherry. "A bit thin, perhaps, but the Sterling kitchen will mend that." "Where is he?" Claire asked, her voice cold. "The drifter? He's in the town jail. The marshal is waiting for the circuit judge to arrive on Tuesday. It will be a short trial. A formality, really, before the hanging." Claire felt a cold spike of panic, but she forced her face to remain a mask of iron. She was a blacksmith's daughter. She knew that to shape the metal, you had to wait for it to reach the right temperature. "I see," Claire said, taking a sip of the sherry. She hated the taste. It was cloying and sweet, like rot covered in sugar. "Then I suppose I should thank you, Bartholomew. I was confused. The cold does strange things to the mind." Sterling paused, his glass halfway to his lips. His eyes narrowed. "Confused? You were ready to die for that man." "I was ready to live for my daughters," Claire corrected. "And Silas Vane was the only thing between me and the frost. But now that the law has him, I realize where my true interests lie. A woman alone in the basin is a target. A woman under the Sterling name is a queen. It was a lie, a beautiful, serrated lie. and she watched as Sterling swallowed it. His vanity was his greatest weakness. He truly believed he was the only logical choice for a woman's loyalty. "I am glad to hear you've regained your senses," Sterling said, patting her hand. The touch made her skin crawl. "Tomorrow, we will have the notary come. There are some papers regarding your father's land, a mere formality to consolidate the estate for the girl's inheritance." "Of course," Claire smiled. "But tonight, I am exhausted. May I see the library? My father used to say the Sterling collection was the finest in the territory." "Indeed. Stay as long as you like." As soon as Sterling left, Claire's demeanor shifted. She didn't go to the books of poetry or the maps of Europe. She moved toward the heavy oak desk in the corner of the room, the seat of Sterling's power. She knew the secret of locks. Her father had taught her that every mechanism had a heartbeat. She used a hairpin, her frost-nipped fingers fumbling at first, then finding the rhythm. Click. The bottom drawer slid open. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them. She bypassed the recent ones and went back to the years of the great land grabs. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned the pages. There, under the year 1876, she found the Begzar County acquisitions. Her eyes scanned the names, the Vane estate, the Sterling forge, and then a list of disposables. Her name was there listed as a ward of the state, and next to it another name, Silas Vane, age 10, marked for labor. But it was the document tucked into the back of the ledger that made her breath stop. It was a deed, original and unpoisoned by Sterling's later forgeries. It showed that her husband, Thomas, had never intended to give the land to Bartholomew. In fact, he had willed the entire Sterling ranching empire to Clare and any heirs she might produce, citing his brother's moral failures. Bartholomew hadn't just poisoned Thomas. He had stolen a legacy that was legally hers from the start. And more importantly, there was a letter from a man in Texas, a confession from a dying sheriff. It detailed how Bartholomew had orchestrated the burning of the street, Jude's orphanage, to cover up the fact that the children inside were the legal heirs to the oil-rich lands he had seized. Silas wasn't a thief. He was a witness to a massacre Bartholomew had spent 30 years trying to bury. Claire heard a footstep in the hall. She quickly slid the ledger into her bodice, the heavy leather cold against her skin. She blew out the lamp just as the door handle turned. "Claire," Sterling's voice called out from the dark. "Are you still awake?" "Just looking for a story to help me sleep, Bartholomew," she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "And did you find one?" "I found the only one that matters," she replied, staring at his silhouette. "The one where the truth finally finds its way home." She had the evidence. She had the motive. Now she just had to break a man out of a hanging cage before the sun came up on Tuesday. The Bitter Creek courthouse was a drafty timber box that smelled of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the impending scent of death. Outside, the gallows stood in the center of the muddy square, the new hemp rope swaying in the biting wind like a golden snake. Inside, the town had gathered. They came not for justice, but for the spectacle, the hanging of the black drifter who had dared to defy the king of the basin. Silas Vane sat in the defendant's chair, his wrists still locked in heavy iron. His face was a mask of bruised granite. He didn't look at the crowd, and he didn't look at the judge. His eyes were fixed on the back of the room, waiting for a ghost. Marshal Vance stood by the bench, reading the charges with a bored, bureaucratic drone. Theft of a government-contracted mount, the killing of Deputy Hames in Bayard County, evading federal authorities for a period of 10 years. Judge Henderson, a man whose liver was clearly failing him faster than his conscience, peered over his spectacles. "Mr. Vane, do you have a defense? Or shall we proceed to the measurement of your neck?" "The horse was mine," Silas said, his voice a low, subterranean rumble. "And the deputy was a hired killer who burned an orphanage with 40 children inside." I did what a man does when the law is a torch in a murderer's hand. A ripple of uneasy laughter went through the room. In the front row, Bartholomew Sterling sat with his legs crossed, a smug smile playing on his thin lips. He leaned forward, whispering loud enough for the jury to hear. Delusions of a dying man. Pitiful. "Silence in the court," Henderson barked. "Marshal, if there are no witnesses for the defense—" The heavy oak doors at the back of the room groaned open. The sunlight from the snow glare outside poured in, silhouetting a figure that stopped the room's collective breath. Clare Sterling walked down the center aisle. She wasn't wearing the mourning black of a submissive widow. She wore her father's heavy leather smithing apron over a dark wool dress, and her hair was pulled back in a severe warrior's knot. In her hand, she carried a scorched leather ledger. "I am a witness," Clare's voice rang out, clear and hard as an anvil strike. Bartholomew stood up, his face flushing a dangerous purple. "Clare, this is a legal proceeding, not a place for your hysterics. Guards, escort Mrs. Sterling back to the manor." "Sit down, Bartholomew," Clare said, not even looking at him. She stepped into the well of the court and slammed the ledger onto the judge's bench. "What is the meaning of this?" Henderson sputtered. "This is the 1876 Basar County Ledger," Clare said, her eyes burning like amber coals. "It contains the record of the St. Jude's land grab. It contains the names of the children who were branded and liquidated so their families' oil deeds could be stolen. My name is on page 42, and right next to it is the name of the man you're about to hang, Silas Vane." She turned to the jury, her voice dropping to a fierce, rhythmic cadence. "We aren't strangers. We are the survivors of a massacre. And the man who led that massacre, the man who paid the deputy Silas killed in self-defense, is sitting right there." She pointed a trembling, iron-steady finger at Bartholomew. The room erupted. The marshal moved to intercept her, but Clare pulled a second document from her bodice. "This is the original deed to the Sterling Basin," she shouted over the roar. "Signed by my husband, Thomas Sterling, 3 days before he was poisoned. He didn't leave this land to his brother, he left it to me. Bartholomew Sterling has no legal standing in this territory. He is a squatter, a thief, and a murderer." Bartholomew lunged for the paper, but Silas, despite his chains, surged upward. He slammed his shackled hands into Bartholomew's chest, sending the older man sprawling into the mud-stained floorboards. "You're done, Sterling," Silas growled. Judge Henderson pounded his gavel until the wood splintered. "Order! I will have order." But the order was gone. The truth had acted like a spark in a dry hayloft. The townspeople, many of whom had lost land to Sterling's encroachments over the years, began to surge forward. In the chaos, Clare caught Silas's eye. She didn't say a word, but she slid a small, notched piece of iron, the key she had pilfered from the marshal's office, into his hand. "The girls are at the livery," she whispered. "Go." "Not without you," Silas replied. "I have to finish this here," she said, her eyes reflecting the fire of a woman who had finally found her hammer. "Go, Silas. The marshal's men are coming." The breakout was a blur of violence and adrenaline. Silas didn't run like a criminal. He moved like a force of nature. He used his heavy chains as a flail, clearing a path through the deputies. He burst through the courthouse window, the glass shattering like ice, and landed in the muck of the street. He didn't head for the hills. He headed for the livery. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of hay. He found the twins tucked safely in a grain bin, guarded by the stable hand who had always hated Sterling. Silas scooped them up, one in each arm. But as he turned to leave, a shadow blocked the barn door. Bartholomew Sterling stood there, his silver fox coat ruined by mud, a small, ivory-handled derringer pointed at Silas's heart. "You think a piece of paper changes 30 years of empire?" Sterling hissed. "I built this valley. I own the wind that blows through it." "You own nothing but the dirt you're about to eat," Silas said. Sterling fired. The small-caliber bullet grazed Silas's ribs, but Silas didn't flinch. He kicked a heavy water bucket into Sterling's knees, and as the man buckled, Silas whistled. From the back of the stable, a horse whinnied, not a government mount, but a powerful black stallion Silas had been breaking for months in secret. Silas vaulted onto the horse's back, the twins tucked into a reinforced saddlebag. He didn't ride out of town. He rode back to the square. The courthouse was emptying out. The marshal was trying to restore order, but the crowd was turning into a mob. Silas saw Clare being held back by 2 deputies. He didn't hesitate. He rode the stallion up the steps of the courthouse, the beast's hooves thundering like drums on the timber. He reached down, his massive hand snatching Clare by the waist and swinging her up behind him. "The post!" Clare shouted over the wind. "Silas, don't let him run!" Bartholomew had scrambled onto a horse and was fleeing toward the canyon, heading for the mountain pass where his regulators were camped. Silas dug his heels in. The chase was short. Bartholomew was a man of ledgers and parlors. Silas was a man of the dust. He caught Sterling at the very marker where he had found Clare shackled. The Sterling line post stood like a tombstone in the melting slush. Silas didn't reach for his gun. He uncoiled his lariat. With a flick of his wrist, the loop settled around Sterling's neck, pulling him from his saddle with a sickening thud. Silas dismounted. He dragged Bartholomew through the mud to the iron post. He didn't say a word. He took the very shackles that had held Clare, the ones he had sheared off and kept in his saddlebag as a reminder, and he locked them around Bartholomew's wrists, threading the chain through the iron strap of the post. "The marshal will be here in an hour," Silas said, looking down at the man who had haunted his dreams for 20 years. "The great die-up is starting, Bartholomew. The cattle are dying. The empire is rotting. And you're going to sit here and watch the thaw take it all away." "You can't leave me here," Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking. "I am a Sterling." "No," Clare said, stepping forward from behind Silas. She looked at the man who had poisoned her husband and tried to freeze her children. "You're just a ghost who doesn't know he's dead yet." She reached into her apron and pulled out the heavy blacksmith's file she had used to fix Silas's rifle. She didn't use it to cut him loose. She dropped it in the mud, just out of his reach. "If you have the will of iron you always preached about," Clare said coldly, "you'll find a way to save yourself. But I suspect you're just soft lead under that fur coat." They turned their back on him. As they rode away toward the ridge, the sound of Sterling's screams was swallowed by the vast, indifferent howl of the Wind River Basin. The snow was melting, turning the white world into a sea of gray mud, but for the first time in 30 years, the air felt clean. Silas felt Clare's arms tighten around his waist. He looked down at the twins, who were fast asleep despite the chaos. "Where to?" Silas asked. "Home," Clare said. "The forge needs a fire, and the ridge needs a man who knows how to keep it burning." The spring in the Wind River Basin did not arrive with a gentle whisper. It arrived with the roar of rushing water and the scent of damp, waking earth. The great die-up had left its scars. Thousands of carcasses emerged from the retreating snowbanks like bleached shipwrecks. But the valley was stubborn. Green shoots of grama grass pierced through the mud, and the air, once thin and murderous, now carried the heavy, sweet promise of clover. At the cabin on the ridge, the silence was no longer heavy. It was filled with the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of a hammer meeting an anvil. Silas Vane stood at the outdoor forge he had built for Clare. His shirt was off, his dark skin glistening with sweat despite the mountain chill. Every strike of the hammer sent a spray of orange sparks dancing into the twilight. He wasn't shaping a horseshoe or a brand. He was working a heavy, rusted length of iron, the very shackle post that had once stood as a monument to Bartholomew Sterling's cruelty. Clare emerged from the cabin, a twin perched on each hip. Merritt and June were filling out, their cheeks a healthy, sun-kissed pink. They watched Silas with wide, curious eyes, fascinated by the fire. "You've been at that piece of scrap for 3 days, Silas," Clare said, a teasing lilt in her voice. "Are you trying to kill the iron, or make it mind you?" Silas paused, his hammer resting on the anvil. He wiped his brow with a soot-stained forearm. Iron doesn't mind anyone, Clare. It just remembers the heat you give it. He looked back down at the glowing metal. After the trial, the basin had undergone a violent, necessary purging. Marshal Vance had returned to the Sterling line to find Bartholomew shivering and broken, his silver fox coat shredded by his own desperate attempts to claw free. The ledger Clare had recovered was enough to sink him. The king of the basin was currently awaiting transport to a federal penitentiary in Laramie, his lands partitioned back to the families he had robbed. The Sterling manor had been sold to a group of Quaker settlers. Clare had kept only the cattle and her father's original tools, moving them all to the ridge. She didn't want a mansion built on blood. She wanted a hearth built on truth. "The marshal sent word this morning," Clare said, stepping closer to the heat of the forge. "The last of the regulators crossed the border into Montana. They won't be coming back for a man who can't pay them." Silas nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The shadows were long, but they no longer felt like reaching fingers. "The land has a way of swallowing the small men. It just took its time with him." He picked up the iron with a pair of tongs and plunged it into the tempering barrel. The water hissed violently, a cloud of steam enveloping them both. When the mist cleared, Silas held up the finished work. He had forged the iron from the shackle post into a heavy rectangular plate. On its surface, he hadn't engraved a name or a brand. Instead, he had hammered out a simple intertwined pattern of a cedar branch and an anvil, the ridge and the forge. "For the fireplace," Silas said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "The metal that once held you in the cold. I wanted it to be the thing that keeps our floor from burning." Clare reached out, her fingers, now healed and calloused once more, tracing the cooling metal. "It's beautiful, Silas." "It's honest," he corrected. He walked the plate into the cabin and set it into the stone hearth he had spent the last month masonry tagging. As the first fire of the evening was lit atop it, the iron glowed a deep, contented red. Later, as the moon climbed over the Wind River peaks, Silas and Clare sat on the porch. The twins were asleep inside, tucked into the cedar crib Silas had built from the logs of his old barricade. The night was vast, but for the first time in 30 years, the silence didn't feel like a void Silas had to fill with vigilance. It felt like a conversation. Silas leaned back against the post, his hand finding Clare's. Her frontier steel had softened into something warmer, though no less strong. "I spent 15 years listening to the wind, Clare," Silas murmured, his thumb tracing the faded brand on her shoulder through the thin cotton of her dress. "Always waiting for it to bring the sound of a rider or a gunshot. I never knew it was just waiting to bring me your voice." Clare rested her head on his shoulder, looking out at the valley that was finally, legally, and spiritually theirs. "The wind doesn't just bring things, Silas," she whispered. "Sometimes it blows the old things away to make room for the new." In the valley below, a coyote howled, a lonely, wild sound. But on the ridge, the door was unbarred. The fire was bright, and the iron was finally at rest. The drifter had found his anchor, and the widow had forged a life from the scraps of a kingdom.